in the face of these threats. And it's not an easy thing to do, because the soldiers who are fighting are also deeply religious for the most part. In Bajor during Ramadan, when I was traveling with the troops, and I was of course not fasting, so after every 2 hours or so I wanted to have a smoke. And finally I said, this is enough, I have to, so I told them to stop the vehicle and I'll get down and I'll go to a side and I'll smoke. So he said, in his very Pashtun accent, he said, go ahead and smoke. It doesn't matter. So I smoked in the vehicle. But all of them were fasting. And yet, organizationally speaking, they have remained intact. There have been instances of desertions, and there have been instances of where people have been court-martialed. But the numbers and the percentages, mathematically speaking, are negligible, given the size of the force. So, before we just have a discussion, all I will say is that the idea of winning and losing in this kind of situation, in very clear terms or in black and white, is probably not the right way to approach it. Because there is no, as I said, there's no clausewitzian victory here. No one can give you a timeline on when this will be over. And I've largely talked about the endogenous factors here, but there are also exogenous factors of what the Americans are doing in Afghanistan, which will have and which has a direct bearing on what is happening here. So it's not just about the movement from east to west. There's a movement from west to east also. And so the direction of causality here is now a bidirectional causality. It's something that, where events on both sides influence the other side. My own, in terms of some recommendations, I very early on into this conflict written a paper in which I had said that the army should not be used directly for these operations. For counter-terrorism, the government should increase the capacity of the police. Because urban terrorism, which we have seen now, which is going to stay with us for some time to come, unfortunately, cannot be addressed by the army or even the paramilitary troops. It requires effective policing and intelligence work. As far as the low-intensity conflict and deployments are concerned, there too, the army should be the second line of defense, and they should create a force which is highly mobile, which has essential support elements, helicopters, and it should be largely paramilitary, with some support from the army and also some support from the police, and so that they can conduct swift operations. Because once you have gone for a sweeping operation with the kind that we did in South Waziristan or in Bajor or in Malakand, you then require these highly mobile small units to deal with the remaining threat. The biggest threat, of course, is the suicide bomber. Because all he needs to do is to sneak in. He's the ultimate smart bomb. He can find his target. He doesn't need an extrication plan, clearly. And he can come and blow himself up and kill 20, 25 people, which is exactly what has been happening. And the moment that happens, you suddenly say, oh, the army had gone and cleared the area and is holding the area, and what the hell is going on, because they're still killing people. The fact is that such suicide operations have a highly demoralizing effect on the population. In Malakand, they've largely been able to control it, but in other areas, it is more difficult to control. As a matter of fact, in terms of the suicide operation, the cities have become a more dangerous place than the actual operational areas, because the operational areas do not have the population, and so they have to basically deal with the army. And most importantly, an attempt has to be made by all of us in Pakistan to arrive at a decision of how we are going to look at the state under the circumstances, how we are going to assess the situation, what we think is required, and if there is a way out. And I've said this, I mean, I've constantly said this to Imran Khan and others. No one wants a bloody conflict. But when you talk about negotiations, you have to give me a clear picture of how many times you are going to negotiate before you're going to use force. For instance, in Bajor, before the operation started, 65 jirgas had dealt with the Taliban, and nothing came of it. So, there has to be some kind of game plan there, that you want to, how you influence these people, whether they will be influenced, to what extent you can use force, or the threat of use of force. Of course, it is easy to say that you have used force in certain cases, and it hasn't really succeeded. And I concede that point. That's my whole point, that it is so difficult. You don't use force, you actually lose territory. You use force and gain territory physically, not necessarily translate itself into actually, putting the writ of the state there, or bringing people there, or resuming normal life there. So therefore, the expectations in terms of the tribal areas, we have to bring down. We also have to see, because one of the things that some people in the liberal enclave say to talk about, and it's a humanitarian issue, there's absolutely no doubt about that, about the IDPs. But then what is the solution? I mean, you go in, you are using force. Using force is not about eating muesli in the morning. It is about going in and killing people. And if you cannot identify the enemy, then there are times when you will end up killing those who are probably not fighting against you, but happen to be at the wrong place at the wrong time. So all of this has to be kept in mind when we analyze this, or when we try to assess the situation. I think this is broadly the picture, the overview that I wanted to present, but if you have any questions or anything, I would have shown you the campaign maps, but you don't have a projector, so I can't help that.
Right, thank you very much for a most interesting presentation. I think I have two comments. I do a bit of comparative work on security issues also outside South Asia. And of course, one thing when we're talking about what you want to call it irregular war or counterinsurgency or whatever we're dealing with, but a systemic challenge to the state, is first of all the lesson that we learn is that these things involve very tough and very unpleasant trade-offs, always. Ethically, economically, politically. Secondly, these things take time. Even the most brilliantly devised plans do never survive the first encounter on the battlefield, whether the battlefield is political or militarily. And the third thing is the importance of recognizing that almost always we're dealing with multiple conflicts. We're not dealing with one conflict at one level, we're dealing with it on multiple levels, which increases the complexity, and therefore also increases the complexity of the trade-offs. What I would therefore try to suggest, when looking at Pakistan, is the extreme importance of indeed disentangling and disaggregating the different things that are going on. Some people are clearly driven by economic agendas. I mean, part of the reason why you have the entire border thing is because some people, particularly on Karzai, make a huge amount of money of not clearly defining the border. Of course, as long as we don't get to the heart of the matter, or you buy these people, the truth is that they're going to have a vested interest in keeping things going. So I would hope, and I was wondering perhaps from your expertise, whether this kind of more strategic thinking is going on in Pakistan, and whether people are aware that this is not about naive negotiations about just allowing the state back in, but about finding a new equilibrium which doesn't involve compromises, which some people in the state, whether it's in the liberal enclave or the right-wing establishment, won't like. And whether you think that's at all likely to happen. Do people have the patience to do that? Do people have the political acumen to do that?
The short answer is that no such thing has happened so far on the civilian side, I must add. Now you have the four levels, identifiable levels. You have the political level, you have the strategic level, then the theatre level, and the tactical level. At the theatre and tactical level, the army has a plan. But the army's plan essentially is an operational plan. To expect that the army will do anything more, and as a matter of fact, they are trying to do that, not just in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, but also in Balochistan. But there are clear limitations of what the army can do. Because the first focus of the army has to be on the operational side of things. The political and the strategic side. Now the political side is where the civilian principles have to deal with the outside world and also have to deal with other political actors which are not in government but are very important to be part of the entire national effort, and also to get a buy-in for whatever policy has to be pursued. And then at the strategic level, the civilian principles and the military brass have to be on the same page. And for that, at the minimum, and we have been now into this for almost 10 years, there is no national security strategy paper that I have seen. Okay, and I've written about it, I suggested it directly to the President of Pakistan, the current President of Pakistan. They showed some kind of interest, and then the entire thing fizzled off. And I've said to them that you have to create that, because that is going to be your blueprint, not just in terms of dealing with other political actors, but also with the military. And it's not just going to be about the operational side or the national military strategy. It will also deal with various other aspects, your foreign policy, your economic policy, your educational policy, and the rest of it. Because one of the things that has happened over the years, but specifically from the time that the Afghan cell was created during Zia's time, that foreign policy has become the subset of security policy. So you have the tail now wagging the dog for a long time. And that is a major problem. So what you have is that the military bureaucrat who's supposed to implement policy and who has to devise the national military strategy based on the broad determinants of the national security strategy is not only formulating the national security strategy on the basis of his national military strategy, but also implementing it. So you have got a double whammy there. So the problem is that now, of course, I accept that they are precious, because now the military has its vested interest. It is a power player. There is no denying that. But if the civilian principles, because there are two ways of going about it. One is that as civilians we accept the fact that there is the primacy of the military and there's nothing we can do about it. Fine. Then in that case, there's no reason for us to limit it. The other is that we realize that they are a power player. They have, and they will try to retain their primacy within the system. But that nonetheless, there are areas which the civilian principles can begin to assert themselves slowly and thereby begin to regain some of that space. It's not going to happen overnight. One very simple example that I can give to you in terms of the structural issues. In Pakistan, we either have not had defense ministers directly, and this being the additional portfolio of the prime ministers, or when we have had defense ministers, they have been politicians who have no idea about the security sector. And therefore, including the current one, who's a very decent guy, but is essentially an industrialist, knows next to nothing about the military. So one way of doing it would have been to put someone there who can speak to the military with confidence, who has knowledge of the security sector, who understands what the military is doing, and can then begin to challenge. Now, one of the things, for instance, that Bob Gates did was an internal, and this is, as I speak, this is an ongoing fight, was to, within the Pentagon, to tell the generals that these toys that you are interested in and the funding that you've got for these has to be set aside, because we don't want the F-22s. We want better flak jackets, we want better armored vehicles, we want a better response to the IEDs, because that is the contested zone and that is where people are getting killed.
Yeah, I have a couple of things to